Night settled over Mayfair with the ceremonial hush of a velvet curtain descending upon a crowded stage, and inside the Duke of Ravenshade's townhouse, a dinner meant for diplomacy instead became the quiet crucible in which a young woman's dignity was tested under the weight of glittering chandeliers and sharper gazes. The Duchess, slight in figure yet composed with the grace of a woman raised on gentler expectations, sat at her husband's right hand, her pale blue gown pooling like moonlight around her chair. She lifted her spoon with a steadiness that betrayed none of the tremor in her spine, though she felt every eye upon her with the same sting as winter rain. At the far end of the table, two marchionesses whispered behind their fans, their glances sliding toward her like cold blades. One murmured something about fragility, another about delicate constitutions, and both laughed with the brittle sweetness of crystal about to break. The Duke, handsome in the severe fashion of men who had forgotten how to soften, allowed the comments to linger in the air before addressing them with a smoothness that only deepened the wound. "My wife has never possessed the strength required for a London season," he said, voice low enough to appear private yet pitched deliberately to reach every corner of the table. "Her health remains unreliable." A crisp pause followed, as though he invited agreement. He lifted his wine as if the matter were settled, unaware, or unwilling to consider, that the Duchess's breath caught for a single heartbeat before steadying again into practiced composure. She did not bow her head, though custom suggested she ought to have. Instead, she held her posture, elegant but wounded, and looked squarely at the tapestry opposite her, a pastoral scene of a shepherd guiding lambs across a meadow. How ironic, she thought, that the lambs appeared more valued than she did, though they were woven only of silk. The table's murmur resumed, soft and poisonous. A viscountess leaned toward her companion and whispered, "Too thin, too nervous, too young. No wonder the Duke grows impatient." Another chimed in, "A disappointment, poor creature." Though truly, what did he expect? The Duchess felt their words as though they pierced the delicate bones beneath her skin, yet her expression remained serene, her lips forming the faintest smile of polite interest. Across the table, the Duke continued speaking, about estates, Parliament, and an upcoming hunt, conversations in which she held no place. She listened in silence, her hands folded neatly, fingers intertwined like threads attempting to hold themselves together. She had once believed that marriage to him meant safety, a place within society hewn from respect rather than fear. But now, seated beneath flickering candlelight that cast her face in gentle plains of gold and shadow, she realized he had given her a title but no protection, a home but no belonging. The first course was cleared, and the Duke rose to offer a toast. His voice echoed across the crystal array, smooth and practiced, but the Duchess sensed a tension beneath it, the impatience of a man pressed by ancestral expectations. "To good health," he declared, glancing at her with a sharpness that belied the polite phrasing. Guests lifted their glasses, though several glanced toward the Duchess as if the toast concerned her alone. She raised her wine with steady fingers, though her heart ached at the implication. If only they knew how often she prayed for strength, for him, for herself, and for the fragile hope she had begun to feel in recent weeks. When the gentlemen withdrew to the library for port, she was left among the ladies, their glittering jewels and painted smiles forming a circle that tightened with every passing moment. They spoke of gowns and gossip, engagements and scandals, yet beneath their chatter pulsed a single shared pleasure, the dissection of the absent Duchess. One woman asked with feigned innocence whether her appetite had improved, another inquired whether she suffered delicate spells. Each question was a needle, and she felt herself stitched into their silent judgment with cruel precision. The Duke re-entered moments later, surprising all. He approached her with the deliberate stride of a man accustomed to commanding rooms, not rescuing his wife from ridicule. "You appear fatigued," he said, his tone gentle only on the surface. "It is clear London does not agree with your constitution. You will retire to Rosehaven at week's end. Fresh country air may restore what the city has taken from you." The words dropped between them like stones into still water. A hush spread. Fans stilled. Eyes widened with the satisfaction of spectators who had witnessed something intimate and cruel. The Duchess met his gaze, willing herself not to flinch. "As you wish," she replied softly, though her voice carried across the room with quiet pride. The Duke offered a curt nod, satisfied with her obedience, then turned to resume conversation with a cabinet minister. But something inside her shifted. She felt it not as rebellion but as a quiet awakening, an understanding that her worth no longer resided in a man's approval or society's whispers. She excused herself with dignity, gliding toward the marble staircase, her steps measured, her back straight. The corridor beyond the dining room was dimly lit, lanterns casting shadows that swayed across the polished floor like ghosts of forgotten courage. Only when she reached the privacy of her chamber did she release a trembling breath. She closed the door gently, resting her forehead against the wood as though seeking strength from its solid frame. A faint ache pulsed low in her abdomen, not painful, merely new, almost whisper-like. She pressed her hand to the sensation, her fingers brushing the soft satin of her gown. A peculiar warmth bloomed beneath her palm, tender and secret, unlike anything she had felt before. For a moment she stood suspended, listening to the distant hum of conversation drifting up from the dining room, the clinking of glass, the laughter that did not include her. A realization, tentative yet luminous, stirred within her. She did not know its shape, not yet, but she sensed its importance with a depth that steadied her trembling breath. As candlelight pooled around her feet, she lifted her eyes toward the mirror and found her reflection gazing back with quiet determination, as though the woman within had been waiting to emerge. Something had already begun. Dawn broke over the countryside with a gentleness London never possessed, brushing the rolling fields around Rosehaven with pale gold as the Duchess's carriage rattled up the gravel drive. The estate, once her mother's quiet refuge, stood small against the horizon yet seemed to breathe with a warmth she had forgotten existed. Ivy curled along its stone walls, roses clung stubbornly to the last of autumn's life. As she stepped down, the chill air touched her cheeks like an unspoken welcome, and the familiar scent of wild herbs stirred memories of childhood summers when laughter had not yet been a rare visitor. Mrs. Albright, her mother's old housekeeper, hurried forward with a curtsy tinged with relief. "Your Grace," she said softly, "the house has been kept ready, always ready." Those simple words wrapped around the Duchess like a shawl, and for the first time in weeks she felt something loosen in her chest. Inside, the small drawing-room bore the gentle disorder of a home lived in by people rather than curated for judgment. A few faded books lay upon a side table, a fire murmured quietly in the grate, sunlight filtered through lace curtains that fluttered in a patient breeze. She sat in her mother's old chair, tracing the worn armrest with tender fingers, letting silence settle over her like a balm. Here, no eyes measured her, no whispers scraped at her dignity. Yet as the hours passed, she felt the echo of the Duke's words again and again, unreliable, fragile, unfit for London. Each syllable carried the sound of a verdict rather than concern, and she found herself torn between anger and a weary wish to forget. 2 days later, the first letter from London arrived, carried by a young footman who looked startled by the estate's modest simplicity. The letter, written in her sister-in-law's elegant hand, reported with icy sympathy that society now believed the Duchess had been sent away for delicate nerves, and an unfortunate lack of constitution needed for marital expectations. The phrasing was immaculate, the cruelty beneath it unmistakable. The Duchess folded the paper slowly, absorbing the knowledge that her absence had already become a cautionary tale whispered across drawing rooms. She wondered if the Duke had defended her or simply allowed the stories to grow, convenient as they were. She set the letter aside without blame or hope, knowing both would wound her equally. Later that evening, while dressing for supper, she felt again the faint sensation low in her abdomen, a gentle flutter, soft as a moth's wing brushing silk. She froze, hands pressed lightly to her bodice, breath caught. The warmth she had sensed days ago bloomed again, subtle yet unmistakable. She whispered into the quiet room, "There you are." It was not a question but a recognition. The next morning, she summoned the local physician, an elderly man who had tended her family since her childhood. His manner was respectful, his touch careful, his words measured. After a thorough examination, he looked upon her with an expression more reverent than clinical. "Your Grace," he murmured, "there can be no doubt. You are with child." The Duchess clasped her hands, absorbing the truth with a mixture of awe and dread. The child, his heir, their heir, lived within her. A fragile hope entwined with unresolved sorrow. The physician advised rest and discretion, promising absolute confidentiality. Yet even as she nodded, her thoughts drifted to the Duke. Should she write to him? Inform him of the miracle he had long prayed for? But the memory of that night in London, the sharpness of his tone, the dismissal, The way he had looked upon her not as a partner but an obstacle, rose before her like a shadow across her path. She imagined his face upon hearing the news. Would he rejoice, or simply claim the child and exile her further? Her heart, still bruised, urged caution. She chose silence, not out of spite but out of instinct, as though the life growing within her required gentler surroundings than a loveless household could offer. Days slipped into weeks. Rosehaven settled into a quiet rhythm of fireside reading, long walks through frosted gardens, and letters from London that she increasingly left unopened. Mrs. Albright moved about the house with protective affection, as though she sensed the secret without being told. Yet the outside world reached her regardless, carried on the wind of gossip. A parcel arrived one morning, small, ornate, unmistakably from the Duke's steward. Inside lay a velvet box of jewels, gifts the Duke had once bestowed upon her for appearance's sake, now returned without explanation. The gesture struck her with more force than any cruel whisper. It was not dismissal, it was erasure. She closed the box with a resolute breath, telling herself that jewels were a poor measure of worth. Winter arrived early, blanketing the estate in sheets of white that sparkled beneath the weak sun. One afternoon, as she stood at the window watching snow fall in slow spirals, a carriage approached along the lane. Her pulse quickened with an unease she could not name. A messenger stepped out, bowed, and handed her a sealed letter. The Duchess broke the wax carefully. The writing inside was unmistakable, her husband's hand, restrained and remote. He inquired only whether her health had improved, adding curtly that he trusted the change of air to be beneficial. No affection, no curiosity, not even a hint of remorse glimmered between the lines. She felt the cold seep deeper into her chest, heavier than winter. She folded the letter with deliberate calm, then laid it into the fire. The flame devoured it quickly, curling its edges into ash. And yet, as the last ember faded, the Duchess pressed a hand to her abdomen, steadying herself against a sudden rush of emotion. The child stirred faintly, proof of life, of unexpected purpose, of a future not yet shaped. She whispered, "You will not be unwanted," her voice soft but resolute. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine the child's face, its small fingers, the weight of a life she could cradle without fear. That night, as she lingered before the fire, a distant sound of carriage wheels reached her through the cold. She turned toward the window, heart tightening with an unnamed foreboding. Someone was coming. The carriage approaching Rosehaven that winter evening did not belong to the Duke. Its modest size and unpolished lanterns revealed as much, but its arrival nonetheless tugged at the Duchess's nerves with the quiet force of a memory she had tried and failed to banish. Snow muffled the wheels as it halted before the entrance, and when the door opened, a small, familiar figure stepped out. Clara Whitcomb, her mother's former lady's maid, wrapped in a wool cloak far too thin for the biting cold. The Duchess hurried forward, calling her name, and Clara looked up with eyes full of the same steadfast loyalty she had once offered her mother. "Your Grace," she breathed, shivering, "I heard you had returned. I came as soon as I learned." It was the first face from her past that greeted her without judgment, and the Duchess felt tears prick her vision as she embraced the older woman with unexpected relief. Inside, by the warmth of the fire, Clara studied her carefully, her gaze drifting, not rudely, toward the Duchess's midsection. "There is something you must tell me," she murmured, voice gentle but certain. The Duchess hesitated only a moment before nodding, guiding Clara into the small sitting room where moonlight silvered the edges of everything. She sat, smoothing her gown nervously, and whispered, "I am with child." The words hung in the air like a fragile vow. Clara's expression softened into something reverent, and she knelt beside her, taking her hand. "Your mother would have rejoiced," she said softly. "And your Grace, this child is a blessing, not a burden." For the first time, the Duchess believed it fully. To speak the truth aloud, to someone who cherished her, felt like the first real breath she had taken in months. Later, after Clara had been settled in a guest room, the Duchess lingered alone by the window, watching snowflakes drift like drifting feathers against the dark. Her thoughts wandered unwillingly to the Duke. She wondered whether he lay awake in London, restless with responsibility, or whether he had already dismissed her entirely from his mind. Their marriage had not begun with affection, yet it had once held a fragile promise, one she now struggled to imagine reclaiming. She pressed her hand again to her stomach. This child would not live or die by the rhythm of the Duke's pride. The Duchess would ensure that. Still, she could not escape the knowledge that the child's existence changed everything. A son could secure the dukedom. A daughter could break it. And either outcome would tether her irrevocably to a man who had cast her aside before learning the truth. In London, meanwhile, the Duke felt the consequences of his decisions closing around him like a tightening collar. Fever had begun its slow creep through his body, subtle at first, then unmistakable. Night after night he paced the length of his study, unable to rest, besieged by a gnawing sense of incompleteness he refused to name. His sister visited one afternoon, bringing tidings of social whispers that grew more vicious with each passing week. "They say your Duchess left because she could not bear the expectations of marriage," she said coolly. "Some even suggest she exaggerated her frailty to avoid her duties." Her voice held no accusation, only observation, but it struck him like a blow. The Duke closed his eyes, ashamed of the ease with which society believed such claims. Ashamed, too, of how easily he had let her go. He tried to compose a letter that evening, a polite inquiry, a measured apology, but the words tangled like thorns. Everything he wrote felt either too soft or too false, and his pride, a stubborn creature, balked at confessing his own failings. In the end, he sent only a sterile note asking after her health. When no reply came, he told himself he did not care. But the hollowness in his chest widened. At Rosehaven, winter deepened. Clara became the Duchess's quiet companion, helping her navigate the early months of pregnancy with a devotion that recalled gentler days. They spent mornings reading before the fire and afternoons walking the snow-dusted gardens where the Duchess's mother had once planted wild rose bushes that clung stubbornly to life even in winter. The Duchess grew steadier in her solitude, finding small joys in the rhythm of the estate. Yet beneath that peace pulsed an unspoken fear, that the Duke might one day arrive and claim the child she carried, regardless of how he had treated her. One evening, as the wind moaned against the shutters, the Duchess sat with Clara and finally voiced the fear that had haunted her. "What if he demands the child?" she whispered. "He needs an heir. I cannot bear to surrender something so precious." Clara, wise in the ways of the world despite her humble station, placed a gentle hand on her arm. "He may hold the title, Your Grace, but it is you who carries the future. Do not underestimate the strength of that." The words echoed in the Duchess's mind long after Clara had gone to retire. But strength did not erase uncertainty. A week later, another letter arrived, this time not from London society, but from the Duke's steward, written in a tone of strained formality. "His Grace's health has declined," it read. "The physicians express concern. Your presence would be beneficial." The Duchess stared at the letter as though it were a spectre risen from the past she had tried to bury. Clara urged her to consider it carefully, but the Duchess could not immediately confront what it meant. If the Duke was indeed gravely ill, the child within her could become the fulcrum upon which the entire Ravenshade legacy rested. That night she slept uneasily, dreaming of corridors she could not escape and doors that opened onto cold, echoing rooms. She awoke before dawn, breath quick, hand instinctively shielding her abdomen. A pale light seeped through the curtains as the first birds began their tentative morning song. Something within her shifted, a realization not born of duty but of consequence. Whether she wished it or not, her child's future was bound to the Duke's fate. As she rose to dress, a knock sounded at her door. Clara entered hesitantly, her face pale with worry. "Your Grace," she whispered, "a second messenger has arrived. The news, it is urgent." She held out a sealed envelope bearing the Duke's crest. The Duchess reached for it with trembling fingers, aware that opening it might change everything she had begun to rebuild. The wax glinted in the faint light, unmistakable and inescapable. For a heartbeat she hesitated, feeling the world tilt softly beneath her. Then she broke the seal. The letter trembled in her hand long before she unfolded it. The wax, stamped with the Ravenshade crest, glinted like a small silenced cry as dawn's pale light washed over the room. Clara lingered near the door, her breath held as though the slightest sound might shatter the Duchess's resolve. With slow, steady fingers, the Duchess opened the envelope and read the message written in a hurried, uneven hand. Not the Duke's, but his steward's. "His Grace's condition worsens. Physicians fear he may not last the week. Should your grace wish to see him, the time is now. The word struck her with the force of a sudden wind, leaving her suspended in a moment where grief and uncertainty tangled in the air like smoke from a dying flame. She sank into a chair, the child inside her shifting gently as if sensing her turmoil. Clara approached quietly and knelt at her side. "You need not go," she whispered, though her tone carried no judgment. "He has given you little kindness." The Duchess closed her eyes. True, he had shown her distance where tenderness should have lived. True, he had cast her away with the brittle ease of a man accustomed to power. But she could not ignore the fragile truth woven between those harsh memories. He was her husband, and for all his failings, she had once dared to hope he might learn to see her. More than that, the child she bore belonged undeniably to both of them, and she could not sever that bond simply because pride had wounded her. "I must go," she said at last, her voice soft yet steady. "For the child's sake, if not for mine." Clara nodded, understanding without argument, and rose to call for preparations. Snow still thickened the world beyond the windows, layering the countryside in white silence. The journey to London would be slow, perhaps dangerous, but the Duchess felt an unfamiliar strength taking root within her. She packed modestly, only essentials, a warm cloak, a few keepsakes of her mother, and as she slipped the small silver locket containing a lock of her mother's hair around her neck, she felt a quiet reassurance settle over her shoulders. The carriage departed before noon. Rosehaven receded into a soft blur against the snow as the wheels carved pale furrows into the frozen road. Inside, wrapped in blankets, the Duchess watched the countryside unfold like a somber tapestry. Bare trees with branches like pleading arms, distant cottages smoking faintly against the cold, frozen streams shimmering beneath thin sheets of ice. She felt each jolt of the carriage in her ribs and each subtle flutter of the child beneath her palm. Fear pressed upon her with every mile, not only for the Duke's life but for the uncertain reckoning that awaited her. London appeared at dusk, its skyline black against a violet horizon. Gas lamps flickered alive one by one as if the city were inhaling after a long-held breath. The Duchess felt her heart tighten. She had left this world in humiliation, and now she returned in secrecy, cloaked and veiled, hoping only to avoid the sting of familiar gazes. The driver guided the carriage through the side entrance of Ravensshade House, where servants hurried forward with subdued bows. Their eyes darted to her swelling midsection, but none dared speak. She sensed their surprise, their curiosity, but also their relief, for in a household long haunted by fears of succession, her presence carried silent promise. The steward met her inside, his lined face drawn with worry. "Your Grace," he said, bowing deeply, "his lordship has asked for you." The Duchess blinked, startled. "He is conscious?" The steward hesitated. "At moments. And in those moments, he calls your name." The words pressed against her heart with unexpected weight. She followed him through dim corridors heavy with candlelight and quiet dread, each step echoing like a memory against polished floors. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors watched her pass, their painted gazes solemn, as though judging whether she belonged among them. The Duke's chamber smelled of fever and lavender water. The curtains were drawn low, muting the world beyond into a muted gray. He lay propped against pillows, his once imposing figure diminished beneath layers of wool blankets. His skin, usually bronzed by riding and hunting, had paled, his breath rasped faintly. When the door creaked open, his eyes flicked toward the sound. For a moment, confusion clouded them, then recognition dawned like a fragile dawn breaking through storm clouds. "Margaret!" The name left his lips cracked, but laden with something she had never heard from him before, longing. She stepped forward slowly, uncertain whether to approach. "Your Grace," she whispered. "You summoned me." His gaze swept over her face, then shifted downward, widening as it rested on her gently rounded belly. A tremor crossed his expression. Shock, realization, and something dangerously akin to hope. "Is it?" he began. She nodded once. Emotion flickered across his pallid features, raw and unmasked, and his hand lifted as though reaching for a lifeline. "Forgive me," he breathed. "I wronged you. I wronged us both." His apology struck her more deeply than she expected. She moved closer, allowing his fingers to brush the back of her hand. "We can speak of forgiveness later," she murmured, voice trembling. "When you are well." A faint smile ghosted across his lips. "If I am granted the chance." She squeezed his hand, feeling the frail bones beneath his skin. "You must rest. For the child's sake." His eyes glistened, not with fever, but with something she had long given up waiting for. "Our child," he echoed, savoring the words. The physician entered quietly, reminding her that the Duke needed rest. Reluctantly, she withdrew her hand from his. As she stepped back, he whispered, "Do not leave me." She hesitated in the doorway. "I will stay," she promised. But as she turned to close the door, the steward rushed down the corridor, breathless, clutching a sealed document. "Your Grace," he whispered urgently, "there is something you must read at once. It concerns the line of succession." The Duchess froze. Behind her, the Duke's breathing faltered. And in that suspended moment, she understood. The true reckoning had only begun. The steward's hands shook as he held out the sealed document. Its parchment creased as though it had been carried with desperate speed. The Duchess accepted it slowly, her pulse hammering in her throat. Behind her, the Duke's labored breathing filled the corridor like a fragile thread binding them all together. She broke the seal and unfolded the paper, her eyes narrowing as the words swam into clarity. A declaration drawn up by distant relatives, cousins who had long hovered like carrion over the dukedom, petitioning Parliament to claim Ravensshade should the Duke die without a living heir present in London. They sought to move swiftly, using his illness and her exile as leverage. The Duchess felt the air turn sharp around her. They did not know of the child. They could not yet imagine the legacy already forming beneath her heart. The steward swallowed hard. "They will push the claim within days, Your Grace. If his lordship passes before your child is acknowledged." He did not finish. He did not need to. The Duchess looked toward the door behind which the Duke lay, frail yet fighting, and her decision rose like a flame within her. She would not allow the life she carried, innocent, unasked for, a miracle of quiet perseverance, to be stolen by greed or convenience. She folded the document with steady hands and returned to the Duke's chamber. He stirred as she entered, his eyes fluttering open. The faintest smile touched his lips, though weakness clouded his expression. She sat beside him, taking his hand carefully, mindful of the bones that felt too fragile beneath her fingers. "You must listen," she murmured, leaning close so her voice would not strain him. "Your cousins intend to claim your title. They believe you will die without an heir." A flicker of anguish passed through his gaze. "They always waited for me to fail," he whispered, "and I gave them reason." She shook her head gently. "No, you did not fail. You simply did not know." His hand trembled as it rose toward her belly, but he paused, afraid to hope. The Duchess guided it, placing his palm softly over the slight curve beneath her gown. A breath escaped him, astonishment, reverence, fear, and joy woven together. "Our child," he murmured, voice breaking, "living here with you." The Duchess closed her eyes for a moment, overwhelmed by the tenderness in his tone. When she opened them, she saw not the Duke who had once dismissed her, but the man he might have been all along had pride not clouded his sight. "We must ensure the child is known," she said quietly. "If you falter—" He tightened his grip with surprising strength. "No, I will not leave you alone with this burden. Not again." His determination warmed her more deeply than the fire crackling in the grate. Yet even as he spoke, a cough racked his chest, leaving him gasping. She steadied him, fear coiling through her stomach. The physician entered swiftly, urging her to step back, but the Duke refused to release her hand. "Stay," he managed. "Please stay." She stayed. Hours blurred into a fevered twilight. Servants moved silently through the room, carrying basins of cool water, adjusting blankets, whispering prayers under their breath. The Duchess wiped his brow with a damp cloth, her movements steady despite the storm churning inside her. With every passing moment she felt labor drawing nearer, an ache low in her body, a tightening that ebbed and returned with growing insistence. She had hoped for time. Time to speak, to forgive, to understand. But time, it seemed, had chosen its own path. Just after midnight, As the wind howled against the shutters and the Duke drifted in and out of consciousness, the first sharp wave struck her. She inhaled sharply, her hand gripping the bedpost. Clara, who had refused to leave her side, rushed forward. "It is beginning," she whispered urgently. The Duchess nodded, breath trembling. She looked down at the Duke, who blinked weakly at her through the haze of fever. "You must not rise," she said softly. "But know this, your heir comes tonight." The words infused him with a faint, luminous strength. His eyes filled, not with fear but wonder. "Then I will live long enough to hear the child's cry," he whispered. The physician, overhearing, cast him a doubtful glance but said nothing. Clara helped the Duchess into a chair near the fire as stronger pains rolled through her, each one blooming into heat that stole her breath. The room transformed, candlelight flickering in frantic gold, the storm outside pounding like a drum, servants scurrying to fetch linens and warm water. The Duchess felt suspended between worlds, one where she had been cast aside, and one where she now held the future of a great house within her trembling body. Hours passed in waves, each one breaking with more force. She leaned forward, clutching Clara's hands, breathing through agony that felt as ancient as creation itself. The Duke, refusing to sleep, watched her through half-lidded eyes, his gaze filled with awe and remorse and fierce, unspoken devotion. At one point he whispered, "Forgive me for the hurt I caused." She managed a faint smile. "We will speak of forgiveness when morning comes." He nodded, accepting her promise as though it were salvation. Near dawn, as pale light seeped into the frost-silvered windows, the final moment arrived. A cry, sharp, insistent, alive, filled the room. The Duchess sagged with exhaustion, tears streaming freely as Clara lifted the tiny, squirming infant into her trembling arms. A son. Pink-cheeked, loud-voiced, impossibly small. The Duke closed his eyes with a ragged, grateful breath, as though the sound alone sustained him. "I hear him," he whispered. "Our son." The Duchess carried the child to his bedside. The Duke raised a trembling hand, touching the infant's cheek with reverence. His eyes shone with something pure and wordless. "You have given me everything," he murmured to her. "More than I deserved." She shook her head softly. "We give each other another beginning." For a moment, the three of them existed suspended in quiet grace. Then the Duke's breath hitched. The physician rushed forward. The Duchess tightened her hold on the baby, dread pounding in her veins. The Duke looked up at her one last time, his gaze lucid and full of unspoken promise. "Do not let them take him," he whispered. Then his eyes closed, and the room fell still.